folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial I'd like to walk you through turbulence noise from Red Giant Universe. Turbulence noise is essentially a fractal noise generator. Now, before I explain how to use a fractal noise generator, it helps to understand exactly what fractal noise is. Fractal noise is layers of noise stacked on top of each other. Each layer is scaled differently than the previous layer. Generally, it's also decreased or increased in terms of its opacity. Your typical fractal noise setup generally has a number of layers of noise, each one scaled down, usually somewhere between a third or 50%, and diminishing in terms of its opacity as we add the layers. So basically what we have is one large prominent layer, and as we add more and more detail, we scale these down and decrease the opacity. And that's how we get our basic building blocks of fractal noise. If I jump back over to the Turbulence Noise plugin, let me skip over to Appearance Complexity, and I'm going to set this to 1. What the complexity is, it's the number of layers that we have creating the fractal noise. So if I set this to 1, I'll see the fundamental layer that we are starting with. This is a good way to show the different patterns that we have to work with. So in my example, I just used a very basic scaled up noise layer. But when we work with fractal noise and add layers of noise together, we aren't limited to just this basic type of noise. You can browse through the patterns and see the different types of noise patterns we have available. Also, below that, we have an interpolation. So how the noise interpolates in space from one area to the next is determined by the interpolation setting. Now, if you're curious and you want to look this up, our advanced setting, which is the default, is a simplex noise function. But other things that are a little easier to explain are things like linear or spline. These are simply linear or smooth interpolations of the noise. And we also have blocky interpolations of the noise. So as it goes from one area of noise to the next, it does a very pixelated interpolation or a gradient pixelated interpolation. So you can mix and match the pattern and the interpolation to make a wide variety of fractal noise patterns. Let me reset and jump back into this appearance. So I mentioned the complexity is the number of layers of noise. Our default setting is 4, and connected to this complexity is a couple of settings down here in the advanced section. So I'd like to skip down here and talk about the advanced. We have influence and turbulence factor. I mentioned in this example here that we scale these and we change the opacity as we add layers. The opacity factor from one layer to the next is the influence. So if I turn this all the way down to 0, we won't see any of those topmost layers. We'll only see the bottom layer. If I turn this all the way up, we only see the topmost layer. In fact, anything over 100 shifts the opacity from decreasing per layer to increasing per layer. So generally in a fractal noise setup, you're going to keep your influence fairly low. So we mostly see that bottommost layer, and then we have the layers of detail adding on top of that. The turbulence factor is the overall scale factor from one layer to the next. So in this default setting, we're using a factor of 1/3. So each layer is decreasing by a factor of 1/3 as they layer on top of each other. The seed is simply a random factor, so any value here that we change here will completely randomize all of our noise settings in turbulence noise. So let's jump back out of this advanced section and go back to some stuff that's a little more simple, like contrast and brightness. These are pretty straightforward. Contrast adds more contrast and brightness is more brightness. Gamma is an overall gamma control, and an invert simply inverts the image. But these all come together here, and this tells turbulence noise how to output the values. Now, it might not seem obvious, but there is what turbulence noise is calculating, and then there is what we are actually seeing. Now, I'm working in 32 bits per channel in After Effects. Generally, a value of 0 would be 0 black, and a value of 1 would be pure white. But when we're dealing with HDR values, we can actually exceed 1, or we can go below 0. If I go into my window info and hover over these values, you can see that I'm going over 1 and I can go below 0. Now, we won't see any visible difference here, but the values are being calculated that way. Now, if you'd like it to not do that, we can simply go to clipped. We won't see any visible difference, but now the values will be clipped between 0 and 1. If you'd like a happy medium between those, we can do soft clamp where we won't see these visible clipping areas, and it will clip everything between 0 and 1, but not have that harsh clamping that we saw with the HDR or clipped values. Now, turbulence noise has a lot of different uses, from clouds to smoke to fog. A really good use and a way to show the flexibility of fractal noise is to generate some very usable motion graphics backgrounds. So I'm going to jump over to another comp here where I've applied tritone just to add a little bit of color to this. We'll start with just a simple, soft flowing background. So I'll go to pattern, set this to billowed, turn down the complexity, and we'll go into our animation and transform options, which we've not covered yet. Actually, before we do that, maybe I'll turn down the contrast a little bit. So I'll go to transform zoom, and I'll zoom this down so we make things a lot bigger, and we'll have this evolve over time. So I can go into my animation and simply click auto animate. So I don't need to add any keyframes or expressions or anything like that. This will simply automatically animate over time. I can speed it up by adjusting the animation speed. I can manually offset the animation using the evolution, and the number of cycles inside one revolution is the cycles. So rather than a huge soft billowy background like this, let's make one with a lot more detail. I'll go to my zoom and turn this way up. I'll set this to 40, and I'll turn this aspect up so we stretch these way out. So note that aspect above 1 stretches it one way, and the aspect below 1 stretches it the other way. I think a good way to do this is to simply work with the zoom, turn the aspect up, and work with the rotation. This way you can rotate it whatever way you'd like. So if I set this to -45 degrees, we'll have a nice diagonal flowing background. I could add other universe plugins like diffuse glow. Let's get into some different interpolations. So let me hit reset here. Let's go to blocky gradient. And again, maybe I'll rotate this diagonally. Let's reset this diffuse glow so it's not so harsh. Bring out the radius, turn up the threshold, and turn down the brightness and reduce the contrast. Let's set this to auto animate. Maybe speed it up a little. This blocky gradient interpolation looks a little bit crystal to me, and I think a good way to bring this out is to use another universe plugin called chromatic glow. Let me drop that on there. Let's bring the threshold down. I'll turn off diffuse glow for now. Let's bring this chromatic glow threshold down, the radius up, and maybe I'll turn the radius X down. And then maybe I can add a little bit more diffuse glow on top of that. So let's reset that. Turn up the threshold and turn up that radius and turn the intensity down. So that's turbulence noise. One thing I haven't showed you yet is Turbulence Noise EZ. This is basically the same engine, just has a stripped down number of parameters. So if I go in and turn off Turbulence Noise EZ has 4 different patterns. It has a complexity control, the same contrast, brightness, gamma, animation speed controls that you are used to. We have the zoom and seed controls. So it's lacking a lot of the transform options as well as the influence, turbulence factor, all that kind of stuff. So this could be used for very simple backgrounds or simple clouds, that kind of thing. So that is Turbulence Noise EZ and Turbulence Noise from Red Giant Universe. My name is Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.